A student of Eastern European history might be aware that there's some Armenian presence in the area. You've got the Manic Bay Castle, for example. But what very few people would expect to see when visiting Moldova is the presence of Armenians still here. In fact, in Grigoriopol, which is today in the Moldavian Pridnestrovian Republic, or in Pridnestrovia, colloquially Transnistria, but you're not supposed to call it that anymore, there's actually a cemetery overlooking the town with Armenian letters on the graves. Very wealthy immigrants to this community who came in the 18th century, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about them because they're fascinating, and apparently very few people know about this distinct ethnic group. I was told a few days ago that there are still people bearing Armenian facial features down in town, but only a few dozen of them. A tourist who wanders off the beaten path to a hill overlooking the Dniester River outside the town of Grigoriopol will find here an overgrown cemetery with some unusual inscriptions. Rather than in Cyrillic, they're written in the Armenian script, a strange echo of a forgotten community exiled by circumstance to Eastern Europe, a community that for centuries has assimilated, Russified, and struggled with their place in the world of shifting borders and alliances. This faded marble slab reads, I believe, in memory of Colonies, 1798 to 1837, may God illuminate your soul. It's one of several beautiful Armenian tombstones in Grigoriopol with similar texts. A paper from geopolitica.am, which I'll link in the video description, has an index of these graves, but doesn't include this one. Most of the other stones I'm going to show you I've translated using this paper as a reference because translating photos of worn monuments isn't very accurate. The Armenians are a sort of shadow society over Bessarabia, what was once the periphery of the Russian Empire. When the Germans were settled here at the end of the 18th century, one colony on the Black Sea was called Gluckstal, about 7 miles northeast of Grigoriopol. This valley was known to the colonists as Kalasova, after the first settlers in the area, the Armenian Kalos family who raised cattle. The Germans named the place Bergdorf, but the name since World War II has been reverted back to Kolosova. On the other side of Moldova, in the famous town of Hinchesti, is an Armenian mansion, one of the largest manor houses in Bessarabia at the time of its construction. At one point, there was a traditional Armenian church on the property, but it was destroyed after the Soviets took power.
And this church used to be in the village. What year did you say it was destroyed?
When Soviet Union arrived, when communism came, it was destroyed.
It's classical Armenian architecture. It's so interesting to see that that was in Moldova.
Back in the capital, Chisinau, is the grave of Manic Bay outside the beautiful Armenian Apostolic Church, which dates all the way back to 1803. It was built on the foundations of an older church, showing the transitory nature of the peoples who've lived, died, and passed through the lands between the Prut and Dniester rivers. Back to the Armenian cemetery in Grigoriopol. According to Armenian sources, this is the tombstone of Elizabeth, the daughter of Christophora, wife of Oganes Satov. It translates directly to, I have in my stock Zagazabet Christophorna, Jasnu's wife Johannes Satov, to be given all year long to the one who calls for a problem in your hands, always for the sake of solemnity. To answer this question, 1816. The first Armenians to settle along the Dniester have a mysterious history very similar to the Jews in this land. In the case of Moldova's Jews, we know they were here early enough to raise questions about their true origins. Bessarabian Jewish settlers were first mentioned early in the history of the Moldavian Principality. They had a small population and at the time couldn't compete in river trade with the communities of Greeks and Armenians already living here. Among themselves, however, the Jews will often say that they'd been living in this region since it was conquered by the Romans. They draw upon folk history and grave inscriptions to support these claims. Geographically, they claimed Jews fought for control of shipping along the rivers just as the Greeks and Armenians had. Similarly, the Armenians living along the northeast coast of the Mediterranean were very well acquainted with shipping through the Bosphorus Strait and into the Black Sea. Although officially present along the Dniester as early as the 14th century, there's no saying when the first Armenians actually arrived to these wild lands. Whenever they arrived and settled here, their skills at ocean travel and commerce would have been incredibly helpful at a time when this was the crossroads of civilization. In any case, the largest wave of migration came in the late 14th century when their capital at Sis was destroyed. The Armenians here linked trade between Europe and the Levant and knew that the Dniester could be followed all the way up to the southern borderlands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is why you have cemeteries of Armenians in Grigoriopol, of Polish Catholics in Raskov, and of the Jews all along the Dniester River, all signs of communities that grew along the river as trade flourished here centuries ago. Back in Grigoriopol, this 5-line epitaph is said to belong to Astvatsur, son of Safar. It reads something along the lines of, to the memory of Astvatsur, Safar's son, and in the memory of the son of Tapan, who died in the year 1721. Back to the history of Grigoriopol, in 1792, Empress Catherine the Great ordered this town to be built along the left bank of the river, a city to aid their trade power. Officially, the town was named after the patron saint of Armenians, Gregory the Illuminator, but some believe it was named after Grigory Potemkin. Many Armenian settlers built up generational wealth here and moved to more affluent areas like Poland, Odessa, and Chisinau. In the modern day, in this entire sub-district of the Pridnestrovyan Moldavian Republic, fewer than 70 people on the census identify as Armenian, but they actually have a fascinating history in the Grigoriopol sub-district of Transnistria. It's time to mention the mysterious underground tunnels of Grigoriopol. In 2018 and 19, local media began to report on the unusual discovery, which they termed underground labyrinths. As explained in 2018, Catherine the Great aimed to provide a home for Armenian merchants fleeing the Ottoman-held town of Dubasari to the northwest. By the late 1700s, areas along the river not protected by well-equipped garrisons were known as the Wild Fields, or the Tatar Desert, the domains of wandering nomads. Constant slave raids and river piracy made the countryside totally unlivable. Most political maps at the time implied huge spaces were left empty, and yet, on maps from earlier that century, we see the name of a town and river, Komarul. Merchants and traders knew of this community, but it wasn't really acknowledged by state powers. Whoever occupied Komarul is still a mystery. It isn't known to Russian, Armenian, or Jewish sources, and yet Grigoriopol lies on top of where it once stood. This map from 1772 was supplied by an Italian geographer working for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Dubrisari corresponds to modern-day Dubasari, but there's no equivalent to Komarul. 2 years later, the same geographer, Giovanni Zanoni, finished another map with more emphasis on Ottoman areas. More detail was given to the path of the river, and Komarul still appears on its left bank, more clearly where Grigoriopol was chartered decades later. Again in 1789, Bartolomeo Borghi showed the town on the left bank of the river. The following year, Austrian geographers mapped out the Edesian Horde, displaying clearly the same community at its periphery. A full 144 years before the founding of Grigoriopol in the year 1648, Dutch geographers were commissioned to produce, quote, general plan of the wild fields, easier referred to as Ukraine, with adjacent provinces. On this map, they have the same area marked, albeit as Komaraska, not Komarul. Novosti PMR, the local news agency, questions the origins of this town, saying its pronunciation is, quote, phonetically similar to Turkism, which I would assume means Turkish, but also note similar sounding words in Moldavian and Russian. Komoare in Moldavian could mean treasure, while in Russian, komora means cage, closet, or pantry. This has led the mostly elderly residents of Grigoriopol to associate the area with buried treasure and underground passageways. Nowadays, several are being shown to mostly Russian-language media. Old-timers like to tell the younger generation stories about how they were built, quote, at the time of the Turks and the Tatars before the Russo-Turkish War. So why Ottoman sources don't have more info on its origin is a mystery. Local folklore holds that these tunnels existed long before the current town. This one was discovered in the basement of a house adjacent to the main road through the community, and locals have their own stories. Novosti PMR spoke to the head of the local documentation and archives department, Svetlana Kazakova, who related a story from her childhood. After finding the entrance to a tunnel about 2 meters in height, they began to explore, but, quote, we did not get to its end, although we'd been walking for about half an hour. They, my friends, turned back because they were afraid to go further. She believes the tunnel went deep under the river itself, crossing to the opposite side. Perhaps these tunnels were built by the Armenians in secret to smuggle goods to Ottoman Dubasari and back. Who knows? Perhaps it came long before them. A little more about the ancient graves of Grigoriopol before we continue to talk about the mysterious tunnels. In Armenian sources, this is said to be the tombstone of Hovsep of Shurok, son of Pari. It reads something like, This is the grave of the son of Joseph of Tepan, and his children erected it. I'm doing my best to translate these sources from PDFs and faded old photographs without using inaccurate AI image programs. Another article from early 2019 mentions these tunnels, specifically stating that Natalia Berzan of the Pridnestrovian Geographical Society discovered grooves in the walls of one of the newly discovered ones. More photos are included, along with the explanation that they've been found mostly around the center of town, overfilled with rubble. What's interesting about the photos in the article is how similar they appear to the underground tunnels at the Manic Bay Castle in Hinchesti.
This is an untouched part. Wait, to the left.
Manic Bey was born in Ottoman Rus, now in Bulgaria, to a family of grain merchants. Born in 1769 as Emanuel Mirzoyan, the entire family benefited greatly from their business supplying traders and travelers, wealthy businessmen, and entrepreneurs as they passed through the Balkans. By the early 1800s, he was rumored to be the richest man in the Balkans, and in 1808, Sultan Mahmud II issued a decree that all Wallachian boyars must recognize his primacy, making him an Armenian prince of Moldavia. 1808 was also the year Manic Bey's troubles began. If there's one thing the Ottomans loved doing more than fighting Greeks and Serbs, it's scheming. Manic's friend and protector, General Alamdar Mustafa Pasha, seized the reins of government and had plans to make Manic Bey the ruler of Wallachia. When his plot failed, the general killed himself and Manic fled to Bucharest. There, he normalized his relations with the Ottoman state and opened Manic's Inn, a place that famously exists to this day. Around this time, he acquired the estates in Hinchesti, but this famous manor house wouldn't be completed until near the end of his life. Finding himself stuck between two worlds, he acted as a mediator between rebel Ottoman units and the Russians during the Russo-Turkish War, holding negotiations at his inn in Bucharest. This is where the Treaty of Bucharest was signed. The Ottomans were doing poorly, so they agreed to turn over the lands between the Prut and Dniester to the Russian Empire. The Russians were eager to stop fighting, knowing that Napoleon was coming for them and that they wouldn't last long in a war on two fronts. The land taken by the Russians became Bessarabia, the event celebrated by this monument in front of Bender Castle in Transnistria. In the PMR, more properly, Pridnestrovi. This all left Manic in a precarious position. The Russians loved him for his mediation, but saw him as a bit rebellious, so he died mysteriously on a hunting trip with a number of Russian officers and noblemen, an event many believe was a targeted assassination. This estate in Hinchesti was his family home, where his descendants lived up until the Soviet era.
This is the old Hunter's Lodge. In Soviet times it was a museum, and that was the first director of the museum.
This 13-line tombstone was set in the shadow of the Armenian church in Chisinau, which reads, "Here the body of Dragoman Bey is buried, state councilor and cavalier Manic Bey, who died on 20 June 1817 at the age of 48. The The church here was built in 1803 as the Armenian Apostolic Church of the Holy Mother of God. After the Peace of 1812, the Armenian Archbishop of Moldavia had to flee Ottoman rule and took refuge in this church under Russian protection. Armenians on the Ottoman side of the Prut continued to recognize his religious authority, no doubt creating some tensions between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman state. These slabs next to Manik Bey commemorate his family. Here's a marker for his daughter, who died in early February 1824. Another grave, which has interesting carvings that kind of look like a bowl, commemorates the wives of a separate Armenian nobleman, Yagud Zambakchayan. This portico is a more recent addition to the church, added sometime between 1872 and 1885. In the courtyard, several monuments are to the Armenian genocide and to the December 1988 earthquake that devastated Soviet Armenia. Back at Manik Bey's family estate in Hinchesti, we can see inside the museum photos of the old traditional Church of the Holy Mother of God that was located on this property but has long since been destroyed. Ground was broken on it sometime in the first half of the 19th century, and it contained a burial vault for the Bey's family. Now, this video is kind of just me riffing and talking a little bit about the Armenian sites I saw in Moldova, but seeing as how very few people do tours along these lines, I am planning on going back and hopefully actually getting a tour of these tunnels in Grigoriopol, although Pridnestrovian media hasn't reported on it in quite a few years, unfortunately.